My lawyer called me on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15. Not her paralegal, not the automated calendar reminder that pings me about billing statements. Rebecca Sinclair herself, calling from her cell phone, which I knew because she'd given it to me 11 years ago after Margaret's estate closed and told me to call if anything ever felt wrong. In 11 years, I had used that number exactly twice. I was in my garage in Scottsdale, Arizona, sanding down an old rocking chair that had belonged to my father. I picked up on the first ring. She said, "Walter, it's Rebecca. I need you to come to my office this afternoon. Can you get here by 4?" I said, "What happened?" She said, "I'd rather show you than tell you. 4 o'clock work?" There was something underneath her voice, a register I recognized because I'd spent 31 years listening for exactly that tone in other people's voices for a living. Rebecca Sinclair did not rattle. She had built her practice on being the calmest person in every room she occupied. What I heard was not panic. It was the specific, careful restraint of someone who has found something and is choosing her words before she says them out loud to the person they concern. I said, "I'll be there at 4. I finished sanding the armrest. I put the chair back on its blanket in the corner. I fed my dog, a rescue beagle named Duke that my daughter Carol had picked out for me 2 years after my wife passed, insisting a house needed something in it that made noise and needed feeding. I showered, put on a collared shirt out of habit more than necessity, and drove the 18 minutes to Rebecca's office on Camelback Road. She met me in the lobby instead of having her assistant walk me back, which was the second thing that told me this was not routine. She brought me straight to her private office and closed the door behind us both. She sat down across from me, and instead of opening a laptop or reaching for a legal pad the way she usually did, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the desk. She said, "Walter, 3 days ago, my office received a certified copy of an amended trust document. It's filed with the Maricopa County Recorder. It restructures the entire Kessler family trust. New successor trustee. New distribution schedule. Your signature is on every page." I looked at the folder without touching it yet. She said, "Walter, I did not prepare this document. My firm did not draft it. I have never seen this language before in my life, and I have represented you and Margaret since 1996. I opened the folder. The first page was a trust amendment on letterhead that looked almost exactly like Rebecca's firm's letterhead, the same font, the same address, a license number in the corner that was close enough to pass a glance but not close enough to survive a phone call. The amendment named a new successor trustee, my son-in-law, Bradley Carell. It stripped my daughter Carol out entirely as a beneficiary and redirected the bulk of the trust, including the house on Cactus Wren Lane that Margaret and I had built room by room over 30 years, into something called Carell Family Holdings, LLC. I turned to the second page, then the third, a notarized signature page with my name on it, dated 6 weeks earlier, a date I had no memory of signing, anything. At the bottom, a notary stamp from a woman I had never met, in a city I had not visited that year. I looked up. Rebecca was watching me with the expression of someone who has delivered hard news before and knows the correct thing to do afterward is wait. I said, "Rebecca, I have never set foot in a notary's office this year. I haven't left Scottsdale, except to visit Carol in Tucson." She said, "I know, Walter." I said, "This date, 6 weeks ago." I checked my calendar in my head before I even finished the sentence. 6 weeks ago, I had been in the hospital in Tempe for 4 days, getting my hip looked at. The same week Bradley had come to visit me twice, bringing me coffee and asking gently whether I'd thought about simplifying things for Carol's sake, given everything I'd been through with the hip and with Margaret's passing. I said it out loud. 6 weeks ago, I was in St. Joseph's Hospital. I have the discharge paperwork. I have a nurse who can testify. I could barely hold a pen, let alone drive across town to a notary. Rebecca said, "I know that too, because I looked into it before I called you. I wanted to have something solid in my hand before I put you through this conversation." I said, "Who filed this?" Rebecca picked up a cover sheet from the folder. She said, "The amendment was submitted by an attorney named Grant Dell, filing on behalf of Bradley Carell, who is listed as your son-in-law and as the newly appointed trustee." I set the folder down slowly, the way a man sets something down when he is making the deliberate choice not to throw it across the room. I looked out Rebecca's window. Camelback Road moved through an ordinary Tuesday afternoon underneath us. Cars and delivery trucks, and the complete indifference of a city that had no idea what had just happened, 11 floors above it. Rebecca said, "Walter, I've already contacted the recorder's office and flagged the document as disputed pending investigation. I've also reached out to the state bar to look into whether Grant Dell is even a licensed attorney in this state, because I don't recognize the name, and I know most of the elder law bar in this valley. I picked up the phone before I called you because you needed to hear this from me directly, and because whoever built this used my firm's name to do it, and I am not going to let that stand quietly." She reached for her own phone and dialed, and while it rang, she looked at me and said, "What do you need from me right now?" I said, "Everything you're already doing, and one more thing." She said, "Name it." I said, "Don't slow down for my sake." She said, "Walter, I have never once slowed down in 22 years of practice. I'm not starting today." I picked up the folder. I stood, thanked her, and walked out through her lobby into the Camelback Road afternoon, and stood on the sidewalk in the dry October heat holding a folder that said my son-in-law had rewritten my entire life without me and forged my hand to do it, all while sitting at my hospital bedside asking if I needed anything. I didn't feel rage standing there. I want to say that clearly because it matters to how the rest of this went. What I felt was something closer to recognition. For 31 years, I worked as a structural engineer, first for the city of Phoenix and then in private consulting, inspecting buildings and bridges for exactly one kind of failure. The moment when a structure that looks sound on the surface has already been quietly compromised underneath, and nobody notices until the load finally exceeds what the compromised structure can bear. I had spent my whole career finding the hairline crack before the whole thing came down. Standing on that sidewalk, I understood precisely what I was looking at: a structure. Someone had spent real time engineering this. The only remaining question was how deep the crack went, and how much weight it could take before it gave. My name is Walter Kessler. I am 67 years old. I have lived in Scottsdale, Arizona for 38 years, and the man who forged that document had made exactly one miscalculation he did not yet understand. He had built his whole plan around the idea that a widower with a bad hip and a quiet garage full of half-finished furniture was somebody easing toward the end of paying attention. What he had actually built his plan around was a man who spent 3 decades finding structural failure for a living, and who was about to find his. I spent 31 years as a licensed structural engineer in this state. Before that, 4 years at Arizona State studying civil engineering because my father, a union electrician in Youngstown, Ohio, had told me that a man who understood how things were built could never be lied to about whether they'd hold. I moved out here in 1988 for a job inspecting overpasses along the new freeway corridors, and I stayed because Margaret loved the desert light, and because the work never stopped being interesting to me. I built a consulting practice in the 90s doing forensic structural analysis, the kind of work insurance companies and law firms hire you for after something has already failed and they need to know exactly why. I testified in court 11 times over my career. I learned early that the difference between a case you win and a case you lose usually comes down to which side did their documentation first and did it more completely. Margaret and I bought the house on Cactus Wren Lane in 1993, a single-story adobe-style place in Arcadia with a backyard full of citrus trees she planted herself over the years, an orange, 2 grapefruits, a lemon tree that never quite thrived no matter what she did to it. Margaret Ellen Kessler, born Margaret Ellen Doyle in Buffalo in 1955, taught high school biology for 26 years, had a way of looking at a person that made you feel simultaneously seen and gently corrected. She kept every one of her lesson plans in a filing cabinet in the garage, going back to 1979, organized by year, because she said you never knew when the past would be useful again. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2022 and died that November, at home, in the bedroom we'd shared for 29 years, with our daughter Carol beside her. I don't dwell on those weeks in the retelling of this. What I will say is that the house was different after, and I've spent the years since learning to manage that difference the way you manage a compromised structure, by understanding exactly where the weakness is and reinforcing it deliberately, rather than hoping it holds on its own. We had 1 child, Carol, 40 years old, a pediatric nurse in Tucson who drove up to see me most weekends without being asked, and who called every Sunday evening at 6, a habit she'd kept since she was in nursing school. Carol had married Bradley Carell 9 years earlier. Bradley was 43, a commercial real estate broker working out of an office in North Scottsdale, and he had the specific, practiced warmth of a man who understood that likability could be built the same way you build anything else, with consistent small investments over time until people stopped questioning the foundation. He remembered my hip surgery date without being told twice. He asked about Duke by name. He complimented the rocking chairs I built in my garage, as though he actually understood joinery, which he did not. I had noticed within the first year of knowing him that he was a man who ran numbers on people the way other men run numbers on properties, quietly, constantly, without appearing to. Margaret noticed faster than I did. Driving home from the engagement dinner in 2015, she said, "That man priced this whole room before dessert came out." I told her I thought she was being hard on him. She said, "I hope I am." The early years were unremarkable in the way most marriages look, unremarkable from the outside. Bradley and Carol bought a house in Gilbert in 2017. Their son Eli was born in 2019. They came to Cactus Wren Lane for every holiday, and Bradley was reliably warm, reliably attentive, always the first to offer to carve the turkey or fix a sprinkler head. What I began logging, quietly, without acting on it, started around the time Margaret got sick. Questions about whether I'd updated the trust since her diagnosis. Comments about how much the Arcadia property values had climbed. An offer, phrased as a favor, to have his office run a market analysis on the house, just so I'd know where things stood. Margaret noticed this too, from her hospital bed, in one of the last clear conversations we had. She said, "Walter, make sure everything is documented, and make sure somebody besides you knows exactly where it all is." I told her I would handle it. I understood the specific urgency of what she was telling me only later. After Margaret died, Bradley's approach shifted the way a strategy shifts when a constraint gets removed. The trust conversations became more frequent. The market analysis offers turned into specific suggestions about consolidating accounts to make things simpler. In the spring, after Margaret's death, he asked, gently, whether I'd considered giving him and Carol some decision-making authority over the house, given that I was living alone now and my hip wasn't what it used to be. I was walking 2 miles, most mornings, along the canal path near my house. My doctor had called my last set of blood work the best he'd seen from a man my age. I understood, in the moment, Bradley asked, that the question wasn't coming from concern. I did not yet understand how far he had already taken it. I found out how far when Rebecca called me on a Tuesday at 2:15. I drove from her office on Camelback straight to the Maricopa County Recorder's office to request certified copies of everything filed. Not home, not to call Carol yet, because I wanted to understand the full shape of it before I brought her into a conversation I couldn't take back. The clerk at the recorder's office pulled the filing while I waited, and I sat in a hard plastic chair under fluorescent light reading the same forged pages twice, looking for anything Rebecca might have missed. She hadn't missed anything. From there, I drove to the office of an attorney named Diane Whitfield, who specialized in trust litigation and elder financial fraud, a name Rebecca had given me on the drive over the phone, told me she doesn't take walk-ins normally, but would take me. Diane's office was on the 3rd floor, above a dental practice on Shea Boulevard, a whiteboard behind her desk with 4 case timelines color-coded in different markers. She was on a call when her assistant walked me in, held up one finger, wrapped the call in under a minute, and said, "Sit, tell me what happened." I sat. I put the folder on her desk. I said, "My son-in-law filed an amended trust document that removes my daughter as beneficiary and names him as successor trustee. My signature is forged. The notary stamp is from someone I've never met." Diane looked at the folder without opening it yet. She said, "How do you know it's forged?" I said, "Because the date on the signature page is a day I was admitted to St. T. Joseph's Hospital for hip surgery, and because my attorney of 22 years has never heard of the firm listed on this letterhead," she said. "Do you have documentation you were in the hospital that day?" I said, "Discharge paperwork, a hospital bracelet I never threw away, a nurse who remembers me because I complained about the jello for 4 straight days." Diane looked at me for a long moment. She said, "What did you do for a living, Mr. Kessler?" I said, "Structural engineer, 31 years." She said, "That explains the bracelet." She pulled the folder toward her and read in silence for close to 2 minutes, turning each page with the unhurried precision of someone who reads forged documents for a living and isn't in a hurry to be impressed by them. She closed the folder. She said, "Mr. Kessler, if what you're telling me is accurate, this is elder financial fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, and impersonation before a notary, at minimum. Those are separate felonies in this state, and the fact that he attempted this while you were physically hospitalized makes it considerably worse for him." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you want to proceed?" I said, "I want the amendment voided and the original trust restored. I want the forged filing entered into a record that follows Bradley Carell for the rest of his professional life. And I want to be in the room when he understands what he actually did." Diane was quiet a moment, then said, "Those are 3 reasonable goals." She picked up her pen. "Tell me everything, start to finish. Don't skip anything because you think it doesn't matter. I'll decide what matters." I talked for nearly an hour. She wrote the entire time in a shorthand I couldn't read, and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Did Bradley have any legitimate access to my accounts? None. I'd never given him signing authority on anything. Did Carol know what he'd done? I said I honestly didn't know yet, and I wanted to find out before I assumed anything, either way. Did I have any record of the conversations where Bradley had raised the idea of trust changes or decision-making authority? I said I had contemporaneous notes on nearly every meaningful conversation I'd had in the last 2 years, a habit I picked up decades ago on job sites where verbal agreements meant nothing in a courtroom and written ones meant everything. Diane set her pen down and said, "Mr. Kessler, I've handled around 40 of these cases. Maybe 5 clients have ever walked in with what you just described." I said, 31 years of forensic engineering. "You learn to document the crack before it becomes the collapse." She almost smiled and said, "Let me tell you what happens next." The first call Diane made from my presence was to the recorder's office to formally note the dispute and request the filing be frozen pending review, which changed the posture of the whole thing immediately. It signaled someone was watching closely. The second call was to a private investigator named Ruth Alvarado, who worked out of a small office near Old Town Scottsdale, 61 years old, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and cared only about what was provable, not what anyone wanted to be true. She called Diane back 4 days later with what she'd found, and what she'd found was not a moment of bad judgment. It was an architecture. Bradley had spent nearly 2 years researching Arizona trust law, found a document preparation service in a strip mall in Mesa that produced convincing template trust amendments, and built a paper trail of interactions with Rebecca's office that had never occurred. He'd lifted Rebecca's actual letterhead formatting from an old settlement letter she'd sent Margaret and me back in 2019, a letter that had been sitting in a file box in our own garage during Margaret's illness. He had used our own paperwork from our own house to steal the appearance of legitimacy from the woman who'd represented us for over 2 decades. Ruth had also found that Bradley had formed an LLC 18 months earlier called Carell Holdings Group, registered in Maricopa County, stated purpose, family property management services, no clients, no revenue, no activity of any kind. An empty container built and waiting to receive something that hadn't arrived yet. Diane looked at that filing for a long time and said, "He built the receiving end before he built the fraud. He fully expected this to work." I said, "He's known me 9 years." She said, "He saw what he wanted to see. A widower, alone, slowing down. He read the surface and got the structure completely wrong." I said, "Margaret told me years ago he was always running numbers on people." Diane said, "She was right. He was just running the wrong ones." I have to talk about the conversation with Carol separately, because it's the part of this that cost me the most, and the part I've turned over the most times since. I called her on the Thursday evening of that first week, 12 days before the court date Diane had set to challenge the filing. Diane had told me the conversation needed to happen before we walked in front of a judge, that I needed to know where Carol stood. She picked up on the second ring, her regular voice, tired from a hospital shift. I told her to listen before she said anything, and then I told her everything. The folder, the forged signature dated to my hospital stay, the empty LLC Ruth had traced back 18 months. She was quiet long enough that I said her name to make sure the call hadn't dropped. She said, "Dad, I didn't know about any of this. I swear to you I didn't know." I said, "What did you know?" She said, "He told me he'd started setting up some trust protections for you, that with your hip and living alone, it made sense to have things simplified. He said you'd probably push back at first because you're stubborn about doing things yourself." He showed me a summary, not the actual document. He said the legal language would just confuse me. I sat with that for a second. The legal language would just confuse me. The specific phrase a man uses when he needs his wife, informed enough to trust him and uninformed enough not to ask questions. I said, "Are you going to stand behind what he did? Or are you going to tell the truth about what you knew and when?" A long silence, the particular silence of someone realizing something about her own marriage she'd been avoiding looking at directly. She said, "I'll tell the truth, all of it, whatever it costs me." I said, "Meet with Diane tomorrow. Bring texts, emails, anything in writing." She said, "I have texts, Dad. A lot of them." I said, "I know. And Carol, none of this changes how I feel about you. That's not conditional on anything he did. But what he did is a felony, and how you handle the next 2 weeks matters." She said quietly, "I know, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't push harder when it didn't add up." I said, "Push harder from now on." I hung up and sat at my kitchen table, thinking about something Margaret had said about Carol once, near the end, in the careful way she said the complicated things. "She has your stubbornness and his blind spots. She'll find her own way out of it. Give her the room to." I had given her the room. She'd found it. Diane met with Carol the next morning and called that afternoon. 51 text messages spanning 11 months. Carol had known there was some kind of legal process happening. She had not known the documents were forged, had not known about the LLC, had been actively kept from the specifics by her own husband. That was the accurate read of it, and the legally significant one. Diane told me she'd also filed a formal complaint with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office alongside the state bar complaint against Grant Dell, the supposed attorney who'd filed the amendment, and who turned out, Ruth confirmed within 2 days, not to hold a valid law license in Arizona at all, a manufactured name attached to a manufactured filing. Diane asked if I was ready for the hearing. I told her I'd been ready since I stood on the sidewalk outside Rebecca's office with that folder in my hand. Carol drove up from Tucson the night before, without being asked, called at 5, and said she was already in the car. She arrived at 9, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything in full, start to finish, the same way I'd told Diane. She listened the way her mother used to listen, completely, without interrupting once. When I finished, she looked at the table for a moment and said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I said, "I'm functional." She said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't." "Okay, comes after tomorrow." She said, "Mom used to say you'd take care of every structure in the state before you'd take care of yourself." I said, "She wasn't wrong about much." We talked until almost midnight. I lay awake afterward, not anxious, just alert, the particular wakefulness of the night before something that matters, not fear, just full attention. I thought about Margaret's filing cabinet full of lesson plans going back to 1979, and about what it means to spend a lifetime building habits that outlast whatever created them. Then I slept. The Maricopa County Superior Court on the morning of the hearing was unremarkable in the way courthouses always are. Beige hallways, fluorescent light, decades of routine procedure worn into the floor tile. Diane met me in the hallway at 8:45. Carol stood beside me. Rebecca arrived at 8:50 because Diane had asked her to appear in person, and she'd agreed without hesitation. At 9:02, Bradley and his attorney arrived, a man named Curtis Reyes, mid-50s, the expression of someone expecting a routine formality. Bradley wore a gray suit, composed, professional, the full presentation of a man who expected to walk out, having gotten what he came for. He saw me in the hallway, and his expression recalibrated for half a second before he smoothed it over. He said, "Walter, I didn't expect you'd come in person for this." I said, "It's a hearing about who controls my life's work, Bradley. Where else would I be?" He said, "I hope you know everything I did came from wanting to protect you and Carol." I said, "I know exactly where it came from." His attorney touched his elbow, and they moved toward the courtroom doors. The judge, was the Honorable Patricia Owusu, 16 years on the bench, a reputation for having no patience whatsoever for proceedings that wasted the court's time. She reviewed the file, looked up, and said, "This is a dispute regarding a filed amendment to the Kessler Family Trust. Counsel, please identify yourselves for the record." Curtis Reyes identified himself as counsel for Bradley Carell. Diane identified herself as counsel for Walter Kessler, trust grantor. Judge Owusu looked at Diane. "Miss Whitfield, I've reviewed your filing. I want to confirm Mr. Kessler is present and consents to appearing today." I said, "I am present, Your Honor, and I requested this date specifically." The judge looked at me with an expression carefully held neutral, though I thought something underneath it might have been closer to interest. She said, "Very well. Mr. Reyes, present the basis for the filing." Curtis Reyes stood and described the amendment in the practiced language of a man who'd made this kind of presentation many times, referencing the notarized signature page, referencing the successor trustee designation, framing it as a family arrangement made with the grantor's full consent to simplify his affairs. He said the amendment had been properly executed and notarized in accordance with Arizona law. Judge Owusu looked toward Rebecca, seated in the gallery. "Is that Rebecca Sinclair?" Rebecca stood. "Yes, Your Honor," the judge said. "Miss Sinclair, is your firm the author of the letterhead on this filing?" Rebecca said, "It is not, Your Honor. My firm never drafted, reviewed, or filed this amendment. The letterhead is a close but inaccurate reproduction of my firm's actual letterhead. I have represented Mr. Kessler and his late wife since 1996, and I have brought my complete file on the Kessler Family Trust, which contains no record of any amendment, meeting, or communication regarding the changes described in this document. The courtroom did the thing courtrooms do when something real lands in them, a sudden, total stillness, not theatrical, just everyone recalibrating at once." Curtis Reyes stood very still at counsel table. Bradley sat beside him, and I watched his face the way I'd spent 31 years watching the exact moment a structural model diverges from what's actually happening in the field, the instant a forecast collides with reality and simply cannot be reconciled. What I saw on Bradley's face was a man understanding, in real time, that what he had built had failed completely, not partially. Judge Owusu said, "Mr. Reyes, I want to be precise. The attorney credited with preparing this document has been disavowed by the actual firm whose letterhead was used, and that firm's counsel has just testified under oath that no such filing was ever authorized. Do you have a response?" Curtis Reyes's voice had lost the confidence it carried at the start. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of any issue with the document's provenance prior to this morning." The judge looked at him, then at Bradley. "Mr. Carell, are you the party who submitted this amendment?" Bradley stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "Are you aware that knowingly submitting a forged legal instrument and impersonating a notarized signature is a felony under Arizona law?" A silence. Bradley said, "Your Honor, I can explain the context." She said, "I expect you'll need to, and not to me." She turned to Diane. "Miss Whitfield, is there anything further for the record?" Diane stood and said, "Your Honor, we ask that the amendment be voided in full. The original trust reinstated as executed prior to this filing, and the matter referred to the county attorney's office for criminal review." Judge Owusu said, "So ordered. This amendment is void as of this date. I am also referring this matter to the county attorney for review of forgery and fraud statutes, and noting for the record that no legitimate basis for this filing has been established." She looked at me. "Mr. Kessler, I want it stated plainly that no finding of any kind has been made against you, and this court recognizes the position you were placed in was not of your making." She looked once more at Bradley. "Mr. Carell, I'd strongly suggest speaking with your attorney about what comes next. This matter is adjourned." She stood and left, and the room came back to motion the way a room does after something has actually happened in it. Diane touched my arm and said quietly, "That's exactly the outcome we needed." Carol stood beside me and didn't say anything, just put her hand on my shoulder and left it there, which was exactly right. I looked across the room at the other table. Curtis Reyes was leaning toward Bradley, speaking low and fast. Bradley sat very still, the suit and the composure still technically in place and meaning nothing now. He wasn't the man who'd walked in that morning. That man had a plan built over 2 years. This man had none of it left. He looked up once, not deliberately at me, just the involuntary way a person looks around while trying to reassemble a world that just came apart around them. Our eyes met for a second. I didn't look away. I just looked back steadily, the way a man looks at a number he calculated in advance and found sitting exactly where he expected it. Then I picked up my jacket and walked out of that courtroom into the October morning with my daughter beside me and my attorney behind me and the folder that started all of it tucked under Diane's arm as evidence in something that was only just beginning. The county attorney's office opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks. Bradley was indicted that winter on charges of forgery, fraudulent notarization, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, the exact statutory language for what he had planned to do with my life and my house. His brokerage terminated him the week the charges became public. I didn't follow every detail of what came after, because I didn't need to. Carol filed for divorce that spring. She brought all 51 text messages to Diane's office and answered every question asked of her honestly. She is my daughter. The difference between being deceived and choosing not to look too closely is a distinction I chose to draw in her favor, because I watched her make that choice the hard way, in real time, and she made the right one. She and Eli live in a rental in Tempe now, 20 minutes from Cactus Wren Lane. She comes for dinner on Sunday evenings, the same day she used to just call. She asks more questions now than she used to about everything, not just this. The first dinner she came to afterward, the three of us sat at the kitchen table, and at some point Carol looked up and said, "Dad, Mom knew, didn't she, about Bradley?" I said, "Your mother knew things before most people finished thinking them." Carol said, "What exactly did she know?" I said, "She knew he was always running the numbers on people. She just didn't know which numbers yet." Carol looked at her plate for a moment, then said, "I should have asked her more when I had the chance." I said, "Ask them now, of whoever's left to ask." She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant, because she did. Margaret's filing cabinet is still in the garage, still organized by year, still full of lesson plans nobody but me will ever read again, and I haven't moved a single folder. The lemon tree that never quite thrived is still out back, and I feed it the same fertilizer mix she used to swear by, even though it still barely produces. The Cactus Wren Lane house sits in the Walter and Margaret Kessler Family Trust, restored exactly as it was before anyone touched it, with Carol as sole beneficiary and Rebecca Sinclair as successor trustee. Everything that matters is documented, and documented correctly, in a filing system I could walk a stranger through in 15 minutes flat. I am 67 years old. I walk the canal path 2 miles most mornings, hip and all. I keep notes on every meaningful conversation I have, the same habit that let me survive a career built on proving exactly when and how things quietly fail before anyone else notices. The documents that claimed I was a man easing toward the end are sitting in a criminal case file now as evidence against the man who wrote them. That's the only record of this that actually matters. My father used to tell me a man is only as good as what he builds and how hard he fights to keep it standing. He wired houses in Youngstown for 35 years and never once let a job leave his hands half-finished. I carried that the same way I carried everything that mattered from him without ever being told to. I built something here. Someone tried to quietly take it out from underneath me while I wasn't looking. I found the crack before the whole structure came down, and I held it. That's the only inheritance that was ever really worth passing on.